My hands were shaking as I tucked the thin blanket around Zoe's small shoulders in that cold, musty garage. The concrete floor was unforgiving beneath the old camping mattress I'd managed to find, and the smell of motor oil and dust filled the air. My 7-year-old daughter looked up at me with those big brown eyes that always reminded me so much of her father, and whispered, "Mommy, why can't I sleep inside with everyone else?" I felt my heart break into 1,000 pieces, but I forced myself to smile. "It's just for tonight, baby. Think of it as a camping adventure, okay?" My voice was steady, but inside I was screaming. The October wind rattled the garage door, and I pulled my cardigan tighter around us both as I sat on the edge of that makeshift bed. "But it's cold, and it smells funny," Zoe said, her voice so small it barely carried over the sound of the wind outside. She clutched her stuffed elephant, Mr. Peanuts, close to her chest. That elephant had been with her since she was 2, a gift from her daddy before he deployed overseas for the last time. "I know, sweetheart. I'll stay right here with you until you fall asleep." I stroked her dark hair, the same color as mine, and tried to push down the rage that was building in my chest like a storm. How had we gotten here? How had I let this happen to my precious girl? Earlier that afternoon, everything had seemed so normal. We'd driven the 3 hours from our little apartment in Columbus to Karen and Paul Harrington's sprawling house in the suburbs of Cincinnati for what was supposed to be a family weekend. It was Zoe's first time meeting her paternal grandparents and Uncle Marcus, and I'd been nervous but hopeful. After all, she was their blood too, wasn't she? The house was exactly what I'd expected from David's descriptions before he passed away 2 years ago. A massive 2-story colonial with perfectly manicured lawns, white picket fence, and flower beds that looked like they belonged in a magazine. Karen had answered the door wearing a crisp white blouse and pearls, her silver hair styled in a perfect bob that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "You must be Ava," she'd said, her smile polite but cold. Her eyes had immediately gone to Zoe, who was hiding behind my legs, suddenly shy. "And this is—" Zoe. The way she said my daughter's name, like it left a bad taste in her mouth, should have been my first warning sign. Paul had appeared behind his wife, a tall man with graying temples and the same blue eyes that David had inherited. He'd shaken my hand firmly, but barely glanced at Zoe. "Welcome to our home," he'd said, though his tone suggested we were anything but welcome. Marcus, David's younger brother, had been lounging in the living room when we walked in. At 35, he was everything David hadn't been. Arrogant, entitled, and completely self-absorbed. He'd looked up from his phone just long enough to give us a dismissive nod, before returning to whatever was apparently more important than meeting his niece for the first time. "So," Karen had said, as we stood awkwardly in their pristine living room, "we've prepared the guest room for you, Ava. It has a lovely queen bed and an ensuite bathroom." "Thank you," I'd replied, setting down our overnight bags. Where should I put Zoe's things? The silence that followed was deafening. Karen and Paul exchanged a look that I couldn't quite read, while Marcus continued to scroll through his phone as if we didn't exist. "Well," Karen had said slowly, "the thing is, we only have the one guest room, and it's really more suited for adults." "I don't understand," I'd said, though a cold feeling was starting to spread through my stomach. "Zoe can share the bed with me. She's small, and she won't take up much room." Paul had cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Ava, you have to understand our position here. Zoe isn't, well, she isn't technically family." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Excuse me, what Paul means," Karen had jumped in quickly, "is that you and David were never married. Legally speaking, there's no real connection between Zoe and our family." I felt the blood drain from my face. "She's David's daughter, your granddaughter." "According to you," Marcus had said without looking up from his phone. "But you know how these things go. Paternity can be questionable." The rage that shot through me in that moment was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, and it took every ounce of self-control I had not to launch myself at him. "How dare you!" Now, Paul had said, raising his hands as if to calm me down. "Let's not get emotional about this. We're not saying we don't believe you, but the fact remains that David died before he could make things official. He was deployed," I'd said through gritted teeth. "We were planning to get married when he came back." "Plans change," Karen had said with a shrug that made me want to scream. "The point is, we have certain standards in this house, and we prefer to keep our guest accommodations for actual family members." Zoe had been sitting on the couch through this entire exchange, quietly coloring in the activity book I'd brought for the car ride. She was used to adult conversations going over her head, but I could see her little ears perking up at the tense tone in our voices. "So where exactly do you expect my daughter to sleep?" I'd asked, my voice deadly quiet. "Well," Karen had said, "there's a perfectly good camping setup in the garage. Marcus used to sleep out there all the time when he was a boy during summer camping trips." It builds character. The garage. I'd repeated the words slowly, making sure I'd heard correctly. "You want my 7-year-old daughter to sleep in your garage. It's clean," Paul had added helpfully. "And there's an old mattress out there from when the boys were younger. It's actually quite cozy once you get used to it." I'd looked around that pristine living room with its expensive furniture and family photos that notably didn't include any pictures of David in his military uniform. Photos I knew existed because I'd seen them in David's personal effects. These people, who claimed to be his family, had erased him from their perfect life, just like they were trying to erase his daughter. "And if I refuse?" I'd asked. "Well," Karen had said with that same cold smile, "you're certainly welcome to find accommodations elsewhere. There's a Motel 6 about 20 minutes down the highway. The trap was perfect, and they knew it. I'd driven 3 hours with a 7-year-old who'd been excited all week to meet her daddy's family. I'd spent money I didn't really have on gas and a hostess gift, a beautiful potted orchid that was now sitting forgotten on their kitchen counter, and now they were essentially blackmailing me into accepting their humiliating terms, or leaving entirely, which would break Zoe's heart. "Mommy?" Zoe's small voice brought me back to the present, to the cold garage where my precious girl was trying to be brave. "Are you okay?" I realized I'd been sitting there in silence for several minutes, lost in the memory of that awful afternoon. Zoe was looking up at me with concern in her big brown eyes, and I felt my heart break all over again. "I'm fine, baby," I whispered, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "I was just thinking about Daddy." The question caught me off guard. Zoe didn't talk about David very often anymore. She'd been so young when he died, and sometimes I worried she was starting to forget him. "Yeah," I said softly. "About Daddy. Do you think he would like his family?" she asked, and there was something in her voice that told me she'd picked up on more of the tension than I'd realized. I thought about David. Kind, generous David who would have been absolutely horrified by his family's behavior. David who used to read Zoe bedtime stories over video calls from whatever base he was stationed at. David who had Zoe's ultrasound picture taped to the inside of his helmet and her baby photos in his wallet when he died. "Your daddy loved you more than anything in the whole world," I said, which was true, "and he would never, ever let anyone treat you the way—" I stopped myself before I could finish that sentence. Zoe didn't need to carry the weight of adult problems. "The way what, Mommy?" "Nothing, sweetheart. Just, he loved you very much." Zoe seemed satisfied with that answer, and snuggled deeper into her blanket. "Will you tell me the story about when I was born? The one where Daddy cried happy tears?" I smiled despite everything. It was one of her favorite stories, and one of my favorite memories. "Okay, but then you have to promise to go to sleep." "I promise." I settled in beside her on that uncomfortable mattress and began the familiar story. It was a snowy February morning, and Daddy was supposed to be in training, but when he got the call that you were coming, he dropped everything and drove through a blizzard to get to the hospital. As I told the story, Zoe's breathing gradually became deeper and more regular. Her little hand relaxed its grip on Mr. Peanuts, and her eyes fluttered closed. Even in sleep, though, she looked too small and too vulnerable lying there in that cold garage. When I was sure she was asleep, I carefully stood up and walked to the small window that looked out into the backyard. Through the glass, I could see the warm golden light spilling from the house's windows. Inside, Karen and Paul and Marcus were probably sitting in their comfortable living room, maybe watching television or having a nightcap, completely unconcerned about the little girl they'd banished to sleep with the lawnmowers and paint cans. The rage I'd been holding back all evening finally broke free, washing over me in waves that made my hands shake and my breath come short. But underneath the anger was something else, something cold and calculating that surprised me with its intensity. They thought they could humiliate us. They thought they could treat my daughter like she was nothing, like she didn't matter, like she wasn't worthy of basic human decency. They thought they could get away with it because I was just some poor single mother with no family and no power. They were wrong. I pulled out my phone and opened the camera app, taking several photos of Zoe sleeping in the garage. Then I took pictures of the space itself, the concrete floor, the car parts and tools scattered around, the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Evidence. As I stood there in that cold garage, listening to my daughter's soft breathing and the wind rattling the metal door, I made myself a promise. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. These people had no idea who they were dealing with. They saw a vulnerable single mother and thought they could push me around. They had no idea that before Zoe was born, before David died, I'd been a paralegal at one of Columbus's most prestigious law firms. They had no idea that I'd spent 4 years researching family law and inheritance cases. They had no idea that I knew exactly how to hit them where it would hurt the most, but they were about to find out. I kissed Zoe's forehead one more time and whispered, "Sweet dreams, baby girl. Mommy's going to make sure nobody ever treats you like this again." Then I pulled on my jacket and stepped out into the cold October night. I had phone calls to make and research to do. By the time the sun came up, the Harrington family was going to discover that their perfect little world wasn't quite as secure as they thought it was. The game was about to begin, and they had no idea they'd already lost. I barely slept that night. While Zoe finally found peace curled up with Mr. Peanuts, I sat in the corner of that garage with my laptop balanced on my knees. The screen's blue glow, the only light besides the single bare bulb overhead. The concrete was cold and unforgiving beneath me, but the fire burning in my chest kept me warm enough. By 3 a.m., I had compiled everything I needed to know about the Harrington family. It's amazing what you can find when you know where to look, and you have the legal research skills I'd honed during my years at Morrison & Associates. Public records, property taxes, business filings, social media profiles, it was all there, just waiting for someone with the right knowledge to piece it together. Paul Harrington owned a successful accounting firm with 3 locations across Ohio. Karen served on the boards of 2 local charities and was president of their neighborhood homeowners association. Marcus worked at his father's firm, but spent most of his time posting pictures of expensive cars and vacations on Instagram, funded by what appeared to be a very generous allowance from Daddy. But the most interesting discovery came when I cross-referenced their property records with the mortgage database. The house we were staying in, the one they were so precious about keeping family only, had a second mortgage taken out just 8 months ago. A big one. Big enough to suggest they weren't quite as financially secure as their perfect facade suggested. I also found David's military records and service documentation, all of which clearly listed Zoe as his dependent and beneficiary. Every form was properly filled out, every I dotted and T crossed. There was absolutely no question about her paternity or her legal standing as his daughter. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the garage window, I heard Zoe stirring behind me. I quickly closed the laptop and turned to see her sitting up, rubbing her eyes with her small fists. "Morning, sweetheart," I whispered, crawling over to sit beside her. "How did you sleep?" "Okay, I guess," she said, though the dark circles under her eyes told a different story. "My back hurts a little." Of course it did. That old camping mattress was probably older than I was, and about as comfortable as sleeping on a rock. I helped her get dressed and combed her hair with my fingers, trying to make her look presentable for whatever fresh humiliation the Harringtons had planned for today. "Mommy," Zoe said as I was packing up our few belongings, "are we going home today?" The hope in her voice broke my heart. "Not yet, baby. We're supposed to stay until tomorrow, remember?" Her face fell. "Oh, okay." I knelt down in front of her, taking her small hands in mine. "Zoe, I need you to be extra good today, okay? Can you do that for Mommy?" She nodded solemnly. "Am I in trouble?" "No, sweetheart. You're not in trouble. You're perfect. But some grown-ups are being difficult right now, and I need to handle some things. Can you be patient with me? Like when you had to talk to those mean people at the bank." She remembered that. Of course she did. 3 months ago, when the medical bills from David's final hospitalization had finally caught up with us, I'd had to negotiate a payment plan with the bank to avoid losing our apartment. Zoe had sat quietly in the waiting room for 2 hours while I fought tooth and nail to keep our home. "Exactly like that," I said, kissing her forehead. "Sometimes Mommy has to fight for us, but everything always works out in the end, doesn't it?" She smiled for the first time since we'd arrived. "Yeah, it does." We made our way into the house through the side door that connected the garage to the kitchen. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air, and for a moment, it almost felt normal. Almost. Karen was standing at the stove, still perfectly put together, despite the early hour. She turned when she heard us come in, and I caught the brief flash of annoyance that crossed her face when she saw us. "Oh, she said. You're up early. Zoe's always been an early riser, I replied pleasantly, though I was studying Karen's face carefully. Something about kids and sunrise, you know. Paul appeared in the doorway, already dressed in khakis and a polo shirt that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. How did you sleep? He asked, though his tone suggested he didn't really care about the answer. Just fine, I lied smoothly. Thank you for asking. Marcus wandered in wearing wrinkled pajamas and bedhead, looking like he'd slept off a hangover. He grunted something that might have been a greeting and headed straight for the coffee machine. Well, Karen said, turning back to the stove, I'm making breakfast for the family. There's cereal in the pantry if you need something for her, not Zoe, not even the girl, just her, like my daughter was some stray animal they'd reluctantly allowed into their precious home. That's very kind of you, I said, my voice honey-sweet. But Zoe and I were actually thinking of going out for breakfast. Weren't we, sweetheart? Zoe looked up at me with confusion. We never went out for breakfast. It was too expensive. But she was a smart girl, and she could sense the undercurrents in the room. Yeah, she said uncertainly. That sounds good. There's a lovely diner about 10 minutes from here, I continued, pulling out my phone. The Sunrise Cafe. It looks like they have excellent reviews. What I didn't mention was that I'd spent part of the night researching local businesses, and the Sunrise Cafe was owned by a woman named Betty Chen, who had recently become something of a local celebrity for her community activism and social media presence. She had over 50,000 followers on Instagram, and wasn't shy about calling out injustice when she saw it. Oh, Karen said, clearly taken aback. Well, if that's what you prefer. It is, I said firmly. Come on, Zoe. Let's get going. As we headed toward the front door, I heard Paul say something to Karen in a low voice that I couldn't quite catch, but the tone was distinctly uncomfortable. Good. I wanted them uncomfortable. The drive to the Sunrise Cafe gave me time to prepare Zoe for what I had planned. Sweetie, I said as we pulled into the parking lot, when we go inside, I might need to talk to some people about grown-up things. I need you to be patient and maybe play with your coloring book, okay? Are you going to fix the problem? She asked, and the trust in her voice nearly undid me. I'm going to try, I said. Mommy's going to try very hard. The cafe was exactly what I'd hoped for. Warm, welcoming, and busy with the breakfast crowd. Betty Chen herself was working the front counter, a petite woman in her 50s with laugh lines around her eyes and salt and pepper hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. We ordered pancakes for Zoe and coffee for me, and I made sure to tip generously and strike up a conversation with Betty about her beautiful restaurant. It didn't take long before she was chatting with us like old friends, asking about our visit to the area and complimenting Zoe on her good manners. You know, I said casually as Zoe worked on her pancakes, we're staying with family nearby, but it's been a bit challenging. Betty's expression immediately became more attentive. Oh, how so? I glanced meaningfully at Zoe, who was absorbed in cutting her pancakes into perfect squares, then lowered my voice. Let's just say that some people have very specific ideas about who counts as family and who doesn't. That's unfortunate, Betty said, her tone carefully neutral, but her eyes sharp, especially when children are involved. Exactly. I pulled out my phone and showed her one of the photos I'd taken the night before. Zoe sleeping in the garage, though I'd cropped it so you couldn't see her face clearly. And some people think it's appropriate to make a 7-year-old sleep in a garage because she's not, technically, family. Betty's expression darkened immediately. Are you serious? Unfortunately, yes. Her father died serving our country, and his family has decided that because we weren't married, she doesn't count as their granddaughter. I could see the anger building in Betty's eyes, and I knew I'd found exactly the ally I was looking for. Betty Chen hadn't built her following by staying quiet about injustice, and this story had all the elements that would outrage her audience. A dead veteran, a vulnerable child, and wealthy people abusing their power. That's absolutely disgusting, Betty said, her voice rising slightly, before she caught herself and glanced around the restaurant. I'm sorry. I don't usually get so worked up, but that kind of behavior just makes my blood boil. I completely understand, I said quietly. I'm trying to handle it appropriately, but it's hard when you're dealing with people who have all the power and think they can get away with anything. Betty leaned closer, lowering her voice. Can I ask who these people are? I hesitated for just the right amount of time, as if I was reluctant to name names. The Harringtons. Paul and Karen Harrington, and their son Marcus. They live in one of those big houses in Riverside Estates. Recognition flashed in Betty's eyes. Oh, I know exactly who you're talking about. Karen's been in here a few times, always complaining about something. Last month, she tried to get me to remove a pride flag from my window because it was inappropriate for a family establishment. Perfect. I couldn't have asked for a better setup. That sounds about right, I said with a sad smile. They seem to have very strong opinions about what constitutes a proper family. Betty was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking. Then she pulled out her phone. Would you mind if I asked you a few more questions? Not for any official purpose, just, I have a platform. And sometimes shining a light on bad behavior is the only way to get people to change. I don't know, I said, playing hesitant. I don't want to cause trouble. I just want what's best for my daughter. Sometimes standing up for what's right is what's best for our children, Betty said gently. And sometimes people need to face consequences for their actions. I looked over at Zoe, who was now working on a coloring page, completely oblivious to the adult conversation happening around her. Okay, I said finally. Or, if you think it might help other families avoid what we're going through. For the next 20 minutes, I told Betty the whole story, being careful to stick to the facts and let the truth speak for itself. I showed her the photos, talked about David's military service, and explained how the Harringtons had systematically excluded Zoe from their definition of family. Betty took notes on her phone, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Her expression grew more disgusted with each detail. This is going to make people furious, she said finally. And it should. The fact that they're comfortable treating a child this way, especially the child of a veteran who died serving our country, it's unconscionable. I just want them to understand that their actions have consequences, I said. In that they can't treat people this way and expect no one to notice or care. Oh, people are going to notice, Betty said grimly. Trust me on that. We finished our breakfast and I exchanged contact information with Betty, promising to keep her updated on how things developed. As we walked back to the car, Zoe looked up at me with her big brown eyes. Did you fix it, Mommy? I started to fix it, I said, buckling her into her car seat. Sometimes fixing big problems takes time, but Mommy has a plan. Good, she said with the absolute faith that only a 7-year-old can have in her mother. I knew you would. As I drove back toward the Harrington house, my phone buzzed with a text from Betty. Posted, already getting responses. These people have no idea what's coming. I smiled grimly and accelerated slightly. Phase 1 was complete. Now it was time for Phase 2. The Harringtons were about to learn that humiliating a child has a price, and I was going to make sure they paid it in full. When we pulled into their driveway, I could see Karen peering out the living room window. She quickly stepped back when she saw me looking, but not before I caught the worried expression on her face. They could sense something had changed. Good. Come on, sweetie, I said to Zoe as I helped her out of the car. Let's go see what Grandma and Grandpa Harrington are up to. But I already knew what they were up to. They were about to become very, very sorry they'd ever messed with us. The atmosphere in the Harrington house had shifted dramatically by the time we returned from breakfast. Where there had been cold indifference before, now there was a palpable tension that seemed to follow us from room to room. Karen kept glancing at her phone with increasing frequency, and I caught Paul having hushed conversations that stopped abruptly whenever I entered a room. It was Marcus who finally cracked. Did you post something online about us? He demanded, cornering me in the hallway while Zoe was in the bathroom. His face was flushed with anger, and I could smell alcohol on his breath even though it wasn't even noon yet. I'm sorry, I said innocently, though my heart was racing with satisfaction. Betty worked fast. Don't play dumb with me, Marcus snarled. My girlfriend just sent me a link to some post about our family. Something about making a kid sleep in a garage. Oh my, I said, widening my eyes in mock surprise. How terrible. I can't imagine how something like that would get out. You little... Marcus started forward, but stopped when he heard the bathroom door open and Zoe's footsteps in the hallway. Is everything okay? My daughter asked, looking between Marcus and me with concern. Everything's fine, sweetheart, I said calmly, though I made sure to position myself between Marcus and Zoe. Marcus was just asking me about our morning at the cafe. Marcus glared at me for another moment, then stalked off toward the kitchen where I could hear him having an animated conversation with his parents. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was definitely panic. Mommy, Zoe said quietly, that man seems angry. Some people get angry when they don't like the consequences of their choices, I told her, which was absolutely true. Come on, Let's go sit in the living room. We settled on the couch, and I pulled out Zoe's activity book to keep her occupied, while I discreetly monitored the increasingly frantic conversations happening in the kitchen. I could catch fragments. Damage control. How many people? Lawyer. And each word sent a little thrill of satisfaction through me. My phone buzzed with a text from Betty. Up to 15K shares. Local news wants to interview you. You ready for this? I typed back quickly. Absolutely. Let's set it up. 20 minutes later, Karen emerged from the kitchen with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. Ava, dear, could I have a word with you? Privately? I looked down at Zoe, who was concentrating on coloring a picture of a family of elephants. Zoe, sweetie, can you stay right here while I talk to Mrs. Harrington? Don't go anywhere, okay? Okay, Mommy. I followed Karen out to the back patio, where Paul was already waiting. The morning sun was bright, but there was a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the October weather. Ava, Paul began, his voice carefully controlled. It seems there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Oh, I said, settling into one of their expensive patio chairs. What kind of misunderstanding? Karen cleared her throat. Well, it appears that someone has been spreading stories about our family on social media. Stories that paint us in a very unflattering light. How unfortunate, I said sympathetically. What kind of stories? Paul's jaw tightened. Stories about us mistreating Zoe, making her sleep in the garage, suggesting that we don't consider her family. Well, I said slowly, she did sleep in the garage last night, and you did say she wasn't technically family, so I'm not sure how those would be considered stories rather than just facts. The look that passed between Karen and Paul was priceless. I could practically see them realizing that they'd walked into a trap of their own making. Now listen here, Paul said, his calm facade beginning to crack. I don't know what game you think you're playing, but I'm not playing any games, I interrupted, my voice still pleasant, but with an edge of steel underneath. I'm simply being honest about our experience here. Isn't honesty important in a family? Karen leaned forward, trying a different approach. Ava, perhaps we got off on the wrong foot yesterday. Why don't we start over? We could set up a proper room for Zoe, maybe take her shopping, have a nice family dinner. How thoughtful, I said. But I have to ask, what's changed? Yesterday you were very clear that Zoe wasn't family and didn't deserve to sleep inside your house. What's different today? The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken accusations and growing desperation. Finally, Paul spoke. Look, we may have been hasty in our initial reaction, but you have to understand. This whole situation was sprung on us rather suddenly. We didn't have time to prepare properly. You had 2 years, I said quietly. 2 years since David died. 2 years to reach out, to ask about your granddaughter, to show even the slightest interest in her well-being. But you didn't. The only reason we're here now is because I finally worked up the courage to contact you myself. Karen's face flushed. We were grieving. So were we. I cut her off. Zoe lost her father. I lost the love of my life. But that didn't stop us from honoring David's memory, or from building a life that would make him proud. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Betty. Channel 7 wants to do a live interview at 6 p.m. They're calling it Honoring Our Veterans When Family Fails. Interested? I glanced at the message and felt a surge of grim satisfaction. Excuse me, I said to Paul and Karen. I need to take this call. I stepped away from them and called Betty back. Hi, it's Ava. Yes, I'm very interested in the interview. What do I need to know? As Betty filled me in on the details, I watched Paul and Karen through the patio door. They were having an intense whispered conversation, both of them looking increasingly panicked. Marcus had joined them now, gesticulating wildly and pointing in my direction. Perfect, I told Betty. I'll meet you at the station at 5:30. And Betty, thank you for everything. When I hung up and rejoined the Harringtons on the patio, the dynamic had shifted again. Now they looked like people who had just realized their house was on fire. Ava, Karen said, her voice strained. Surely we can work this out among ourselves, as a family. Funny how quickly I became family again, I observed. What changed your mind? Paul stepped forward, and for the first time since we'd arrived, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. We may have made some mistakes, but airing our private business on social media isn't the answer. You're right, I said, and I saw hope flicker in their eyes. Social media isn't the answer, which is why I've decided to do a live television interview instead. The color drained from Karen's face. You can't be serious. Very serious. Channel 7. News, 6 o'clock tonight. They're doing a segment about how veteran families are treated in our community. I thought it was important to contribute to the conversation. Marcus exploded. You vindictive bitch. You're trying to ruin us. Marcus, Paul snapped. But the damage was done. I stood up slowly, and something in my expression made all three of them take a step back. No, Marcus, I'm not trying to ruin you. You've already done that yourselves. I'm simply making sure that your actions have consequences. I turned to Paul and Karen. For 2 years, you ignored the existence of your son's daughter. When I finally reached out, you agreed to meet her, but only on your terms. You made it clear that you considered her beneath you, not worthy of basic human decency. You forced a 7-year-old child to sleep in a garage like an animal because you couldn't be bothered to clear a space for her in your guest room. My voice was rising now. All the rage and hurt I'd been holding back finally breaking free. You want to know what David would think of you right now? He'd be ashamed. Ashamed that his own family could look at his daughter, his beautiful, sweet, innocent daughter, and see nothing but an inconvenience. Karen had tears in her eyes now, but I wasn't finished. So no, I'm not trying to ruin you. I'm trying to protect my daughter from people who would treat her as less than human. And if that means the whole world gets to see what kind of people you really are, then so be it. I turned and walked back toward the house, leaving them standing there in stunned silence. Through the patio door, I could see Zoe still sitting on the couch, carefully coloring her elephants. She looked up when she saw me coming and smiled. All done with the grown-up talk? She asked. For now, I said, sitting down beside her. What are you working on? It's a family of elephants, she said proudly, showing me her picture. The mommy elephant is protecting the baby elephant from the mean elephants. Sometimes children see things more clearly than adults ever could. That's beautiful, sweetheart, I said, kissing the top of her head. The mommy elephant looks very brave. She is, Zoe said matter-of-factly. Mommy elephants always protect their babies. That's what mommies do. Behind us, I could hear the Harringtons having another heated discussion in the kitchen. Their voices were getting louder and more desperate by the minute. I checked my phone again. Betty's post had now been shared over 20,000 times, and the comments were brutal. The story was spreading faster than wildfire, and there was no way to put this genie back in the bottle. My phone rang. Unknown number with a local area code. Hello? I answered. Miss Mitchell, this is Janet Rodriguez from Channel 7 News. I understand you're willing to speak with us about your experience with the Harrington family. Yes, I am. Wonderful. We'd like to do the interview live at 6 tonight, but we were also wondering if we could send a camera crew over to the house now to get some background footage. Would that be possible? I glanced toward the kitchen where the Harringtons were still arguing. Actually, yes, I think that would be perfect. We're at 847 Riverside Drive. Excellent. We'll have a crew there within the hour. When I hung up, Zoe looked at me curiously. Who was that, Mommy? Some people who want to hear our story, I said. Remember how we talked about standing up for what's right? She nodded solemnly. Well, sometimes when you stand up for what's right, other people want to help you. And sometimes that helps other families who might be going through the same thing we are. So we're helping other kids who might have to sleep in garages. Exactly. Zoe considered this for a moment, then nodded with the serious expression she got when she was thinking about important things. I think Daddy would want us to help other kids. I think so too, baby. Behind us, I heard footsteps and turned to see Paul approaching with his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. Ava, he said quietly, please, let's talk about this. Surely there's some way we can resolve this without involving the media. I looked at him for a long moment, this man who shared David's eyes but none of his compassion. Mr. Harrington, there was a way to resolve this. It was called treating your granddaughter with basic human dignity, but that ship sailed the moment you decided she wasn't good enough to sleep in your house. We can fix this, he said desperately. We can make it right. Can you? I asked. Can you undo the fact that a 7-year-old girl spent last night crying herself to sleep on a concrete floor because her grandfather told her she wasn't family? Can you undo the damage you've done to her sense of self-worth? Can you bring back the 2 years you've ignored her existence? Paul opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Behind him, I could see Karen crying at the kitchen table while Marcus paced back and forth like a caged animal. I didn't think so, I said softly. So no, Mr. Harrington, you can't fix this. But maybe, just maybe, what happens next will prevent another family from going through what we've been through. A van pulled into the driveway, and I could see the Channel 7 News logo on the side. Paul followed my gaze and his face went white. "It's too late to stop this train," I told him. "Oh, but it's not too late to think about what kind of man you want to be when it's all over." The reporters were walking up the front path now, and I could see neighbors starting to come out of their houses to see what was happening. The perfect private world of Riverside Estates was about to be shattered, and everyone would know exactly why. I stood up and took Zoe's hand. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's go talk to these nice people about how important it is to be kind to children." As we walked toward the front door, I heard Paul whisper, "God help us all." But it was too late for prayers. The reckoning had arrived, and the Harrington family was about to learn that their actions had consequences they never could have imagined. The war was just beginning, and I intended to win. The Channel 7 news crew was professional but clearly energized by the story. Janet Rodriguez, the lead reporter, was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the sort of calm confidence that comes from years of dealing with difficult situations. She spent a few minutes talking with Zoe, complimenting her coloring and asking gentle questions about her favorite activities, before turning her attention to me. "Ms. Mitchell," she said as her cameraman set up equipment in the Harringtons' pristine living room, "I want you to know that we've already received an overwhelming response to this story. Our phones haven't stopped ringing since Betty Chen's post went viral." I glanced toward the kitchen, where the Harrington family had barricaded themselves, their voices a constant low hum of panic and recrimination. What kind of response? Outrage, mostly. A lot of veterans' families sharing their own stories of feeling excluded or mistreated, but also offers of help, people wanting to know how they can support you and Zoe. The camera operator, a young man with a gentle demeanor, knelt down to Zoe's level. "Hey there, kiddo. We're going to be filming your mom talking to Janet for a little while. Is that okay with you?" Zoe looked to me for confirmation, and I nodded. "It's okay, sweetheart. These people are here to help us tell our story." "Like the story about the elephants?" she asked. "Exactly like that," I said, and Janet's expression sharpened with interest. "Elephants?" Janet asked. "Zoe was just telling me about a picture she colored, a mother elephant protecting her baby from mean elephants. Sometimes children understand things better than adults do." Janet smiled and made a note. "Can I ask you something, Zoe? What do you think makes a family?" Zoe considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "People who love each other and take care of each other," she said finally, "and who make sure everyone has a safe place to sleep." The simplicity and wisdom of her answer hung in the air, and I saw Janet's eyes soften. Behind us, I heard a sharp intake of breath from the kitchen doorway. Karen had been listening. "That's a beautiful answer," Janet said. "You're a very smart little girl." The interview itself was straightforward. Janet asked me to walk through the events of the past 24 hours, and I did so calmly and factually. I showed her the photos I'd taken of Zoe sleeping in the garage, explained about David's military service and his family's refusal to acknowledge Zoe as their granddaughter, and described the conversation where they'd made it clear that she wasn't technically family. Throughout it all, I kept my voice level and my emotions in check. I didn't need to dramatize anything. The facts spoke for themselves. "What do you hope to accomplish by sharing your story?" Janet asked as we neared the end of the interview. "I want people to understand that actions have consequences," I said. "When you treat a child with cruelty, when you make them feel unwanted and unloved, that has real impact. David died serving our country, and his daughter deserves better than to be treated like she doesn't matter. And what would you say to the Harrington family if they're watching?" I looked directly into the camera. "I'd say that it's never too late to choose kindness, but it is too late to pretend that what you've done doesn't matter." As the crew was packing up their equipment, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, the voice was familiar. "Ava, this is Sandra Morrison from Morrison & Associates." My breath caught. Sandra had been my boss at the law firm where I'd worked before Zoe was born. We'd kept in touch sporadically over the years, but I hadn't heard from her in months. "Sandra, how are you?" "I'm well, but more importantly, how are you?" "I just saw Betty Chen's post about what you're going through, and I had to call." I stepped away from the news crew, lowering my voice. "It's been challenging. I can imagine. Listen, I know you left the firm to focus on raising Zoe after David passed, but I want you to know that your position is still open if you ever want to come back. And in the meantime, if you need any legal assistance with this situation, we'd be happy to help. Pro bono, of course." The offer was unexpected and overwhelming. "Sandra, that's incredibly generous. David was a hero, Ava, and what they're doing to his daughter is unconscionable. Let us help you fight back properly. After I hung up, I felt a surge of something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope, not just for justice, but for the future. Maybe this nightmare would actually lead to something better for Zoe and me. The news crew finished loading their equipment and headed back to the station for the 6 o'clock broadcast. As soon as their van pulled out of the driveway, Paul appeared at my side. "Are you happy now?" he asked, his voice bitter. "You've destroyed our reputation, probably cost me clients, and humiliated our entire family." I turned to face him, and for the first time since we'd arrived, I let him see the full force of my anger. "Your reputation destroyed itself the moment you decided to treat a 7-year-old like garbage. Your clients are going to find out what kind of man you really are, and your family is humiliated because your actions are humiliating. She's not even—" he started, then stopped himself. "Not even what?" I challenged. "Not even your granddaughter. Not even human. Not even worthy of basic decency." Paul's face was red now, his carefully maintained composure completely gone. "This is blackmail. You're trying to extort us." "Extort you into what?" "Treating your granddaughter with kindness." "What a terrible demand." Karen appeared beside her husband, her eyes swollen from crying. "Ava, please, think about what you're doing to our family." "I am thinking about it," I said. "I'm thinking about how your family treated my daughter, and I'm making sure everyone knows exactly what kind of people you are." Marcus pushed past his parents, clearly drunk despite the early hour. "You want to know what I think? I think you're a gold-digging whore who got knocked up by my dead brother and now you're trying to cash in." The words hit me like a physical blow. But before I could respond, something unexpected happened. Zoe, who had been sitting quietly on the couch, stood up and walked over to us. "That's not nice," she said to Marcus, her small voice cutting through the adult anger like a knife. "My mommy isn't a bad person. She takes care of me and works really hard, and she loved my daddy very much." Marcus looked down at her with surprise, as if he'd forgotten she could hear everything that was being said. "Then," Zoe continued with the devastating honesty of a 7-year-old, "my daddy wouldn't like you very much. He told Mommy that families are supposed to love each other, but you don't love anybody. You're just mean." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus, who had been so ready to attack me, found himself speechless in the face of a child's simple truth. Karen burst into fresh tears. "Oh God, what have we done?" "You've shown me exactly who you are," I said quietly. "All of you. And now everyone else gets to see it too." My phone buzzed with a text from Janet Rodriguez. "Interview airs in 20 minutes. Brace yourself. This is going to be big." I picked up Zoe and our bags. "We're leaving," I announced. "But you were supposed to stay until tomorrow," Paul protested, as if maintaining the pretense of a normal family visit still mattered. "And that was before your son called me a whore in front of my daughter," I said. "We'll find somewhere else to stay tonight." "Wait," Karen said desperately. "Please, just wait. Let's talk about this. Really talk." I paused at the front door. "Mrs. Harrington, the time for talking was 2 years ago when your son died, and you could have reached out to his daughter. The time for talking was yesterday when you could have welcomed us into your home. The time for talking was this morning when you could have apologized and tried to make things right." I shifted Zoe's weight in my arms. "But you didn't want to talk then. You wanted to humiliate and exclude and punish a child for the crime of existing. So no, I don't think we have anything to talk about now." As I opened the front door, Karen called out one last time, "What do you want from us? What would it take to make this go away?" I turned back to look at her. This woman who shared my daughter's DNA but none of her compassion. "It can't go away, Mrs. Harrington. That's the point. Actions have consequences, and some consequences are permanent." We drove away from that house for the last time, leaving the Harrington family to face the storm they had created. I found a family-friendly hotel about 20 minutes away, got us checked in, and ordered room service for dinner. By the time our food arrived, it was almost 6 o'clock. "Mommy," Zoe said, as we settled in to eat, "are we going to be on TV?" "We already were, sweetheart. Remember the nice lady with the camera who talked to us?" "Oh, right. Will people see it?" "Some people will. The story is important because it might help other families." Zoe nodded seriously. "Good. I hope other kids don't have to sleep in garages." At exactly 6 o'clock, I turned on Channel 7 News. The story was the lead segment, introduced with the banner, "Honoring Our Veterans, When Family Fails." Watching myself on television was surreal. But the story was powerful. The reporter had done an excellent job of laying out the facts while letting the emotional impact speak for itself. They'd included David's military photo, shots of the garage where Zoe had slept, and interviews with local veterans, advocates who expressed outrage at the family's treatment. But the most devastating moment came when they played Zoe's simple explanation of what makes a family: people who love each other and take care of each other, and who make sure everyone has a safe place to sleep. My phone started ringing before the segment was even over. Betty Chen, Sandra Morrison, other friends I hadn't heard from in months, all calling to offer support. Social media was exploding with shares and comments, most of them expressing shock and anger at the Harringtons' behavior. By 9 o'clock, I had received calls from 3 other news stations, 2 national veterans, organizations, and a dozen families sharing their own stories of rejection and exclusion. The hashtag #ZoeDeservesLove was trending on Twitter. The Harringtons had unleashed something they couldn't control, and it was growing far beyond anything I had initially imagined. As I tucked Zoe into the hotel bed that night, she looked up at me with those big brown eyes that reminded me so much of David. "Mommy," she said, "did we win?" It was such a simple question, but the answer was complicated. Had we won? The Harringtons were facing public humiliation and social consequences for their actions. Their perfect reputation was in ruins, and they would have to live with the knowledge that the entire community knew what they had done. But more importantly, Zoe would never again have to wonder if she was worthy of love and acceptance. She would grow up knowing that her mother had fought for her, that strangers had rallied to defend her, and that her father's sacrifice meant something to people who had never even met him. "Yeah, baby," I said, kissing her forehead. "I think we did win." As she drifted off to sleep in that comfortable hotel bed, I stayed awake thinking about the future. Tomorrow we would drive back to Columbus, back to our little apartment and our simple life. But something fundamental had changed. I wasn't the same person who had driven here 2 days ago, hoping for acceptance from people who weren't capable of giving it. I was stronger now, more confident, and I had learned something important about the power of speaking truth, even when it's uncomfortable. The Harringtons had wanted to teach Zoe that she didn't matter, that she wasn't worthy of their consideration or care. Instead, they had taught the entire world what happens when good people stand up to bullies. It was a lesson none of us would ever forget. 3 months later, I was sitting in my new office at Morrison & Associates, reviewing a case file when my assistant knocked on the door. "Ava, there's someone here to see you. She says it's personal." I looked up from the custody agreement I'd been drafting. Since returning to the firm, I'd specialized in family law, particularly cases involving military families and children's rights. Sandra had been right. My position was waiting for me, and my experience with the Harringtons had given me a passion for protecting families that legal education alone never could have provided. "Who is it?" I asked. "Karen Harrington." I felt my stomach drop. In the 3 months since the story broke, I hadn't heard directly from any of the Harringtons, though I'd certainly heard about them. Paul's accounting firm had lost several major clients. Their neighborhood HOA had asked Karen to step down from her position, and Marcus had been quietly asked to leave the family business after his drinking problem became too public to ignore. "Send her in," I said finally. Karen walked into my office looking like she'd aged years in the past few months. Her perfectly styled hair was simpler now, and she wasn't wearing the expensive jewelry and designer clothes I remembered. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. "Hello, Ava," she said quietly. "Mrs. Harrington." I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "Please, sit down." She settled into the chair carefully, like someone who was afraid of taking up too much space. I wanted to thank you for seeing me. I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't," I admitted. "What can I do for you?" Karen was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands folded in her lap. When she finally looked up, her eyes were filled with tears. "I came to apologize," she said, "for what we did to Zoe, for what we did to you, for everything." I leaned back in my chair, studying her face. "Okay, I'm listening. I know you probably think this is too little, too late," Karen continued, her voice shaking slightly. "And you'd be right. But I needed you to know that I understand now. What we did was unforgivable." "What changed your mind?" I asked. Karen reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She handed it to me across the desk. "This came in the mail 2 weeks ago." I unfolded the paper and found myself looking at a drawing in crayon. It was clearly a child's work. A simple house with stick figures standing in front of it. There was a man, a woman, a little girl, and what looked like a dog. At the bottom, in careful 7-year-old handwriting, were the words, "I hope you feel better soon. Love, Zoe." My throat tightened. "Where did she get your address?" "I don't know," Karen said, wiping her eyes. "But when I saw it, when I realized that after everything we put her through, she was still thinking about us, still hoping we would feel better, she broke down completely then, sobbing into her hands. I got up and poured her a glass of water from the pitcher I kept on the side table. "Here," I said gently, handing it to her. "Thank you," she whispered. "Ava, I need you to understand something. What we did, it wasn't really about Zoe. It was about our own pain and our own failures as parents." I sat back down, waiting for her to continue. "David was always the good son," Karen said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was kind and generous and brave, everything we wanted our children to be. Marcus was different, angry, entitled, always looking for someone else to blame for his problems. Paul and I, we made excuses for him, covered for him, tried to protect him from consequences." She took a shaky breath. "When David died, I think part of us blamed him for leaving Marcus behind, for making us face what our other son had become. And when you reached out, when we saw Zoe for the first time, all we could see was everything David was that Marcus wasn't. So you punished her for that." I said, "We did, and it was cruel and stupid and wrong." Karen looked directly at me for the first time since she'd sat down. "There's no excuse for what we did. None. But I wanted you to know that we're paying for it." "How so?" "Paul lost half his clients. The business is struggling. Marcus moved to Cleveland. He couldn't find work here after the story came out. Our friends won't speak to us. The whole community knows what we did." I felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy, but it passed quickly. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, "and I meant it. But those are consequences, not punishments. There's a difference." Karen nodded. "I know, and we deserve every bit of it. But Ava, that little girl doesn't deserve to carry our failures with her for the rest of her life." "What do you mean?" "I mean that someday she's going to ask questions about her father's family. She's going to want to know why we rejected her, and she might blame herself. Children do that. They think everything is their fault." Karen was right, and we both knew it. I'd been dreading the day when Zoe would be old enough to really understand what had happened, when she would start asking harder questions about why her grandparents hadn't wanted her. "What are you suggesting?" I asked. "I'm suggesting that maybe it's not too late for us to be the family she deserves. Not right away, and not all at once, but gradually. If you'd be willing to let us try." I was quiet for a long time, thinking. Part of me wanted to tell Karen that she was right. It was too late. The damage was done, and Zoe was better off without people who could be so cruel to a child. But another part of me thought about David, and what he would have wanted for his daughter. He'd loved his parents despite their flaws, just like he'd loved Marcus despite his problems. Would he want Zoe to grow up without any connection to his side of the family? "I need to think about this," I said finally. "Of course, I understand." Karen stood to leave, then paused. "Ava, for what it's worth, I'm proud of what you did. Standing up for Zoe the way you did, fighting for her, that took courage. David would have been proud too." After she left, I sat in my office for a long time, staring at Zoe's drawing. My daughter, who had every reason to hate the Harringtons, had instead sent them a get-well card. She was 7 years old, and already more forgiving than most adults ever learn to be. That evening, I picked Zoe up from the after-school program at her elementary school. She chattered happily about her day as we drove home. She'd learned about butterflies in science class, played tetherball at recess, and her friend Emma had shared her cookies at lunch. Our life had changed dramatically in the past 3 months. My new salary at the law firm meant we'd been able to move to a better neighborhood, and Zoe was thriving in her new school. The attention from the news story had brought us into contact with other military families, and we'd found a community of people who understood our experience. But more than that, something fundamental had shifted in how I saw myself and my place in the world. I was no longer the scared, overwhelmed single mother who had driven to Cincinnati hoping for acceptance from people who didn't deserve it. I was a woman who had fought for her child and won, who had turned pain into purpose, who had discovered her own strength. "Mommy," Zoe said, as we pulled into our apartment complex, "can I ask you something?" "Always, sweetheart." "Do you think the sad grandparents got my picture?" I felt my heart skip a beat. The sad grandparents? You know, Daddy's family. They seemed really sad when we visited them. I drew them a picture to help them feel better. So that's how she'd gotten their address. She'd remembered it from our trip. Zoe, why did you want to send them a picture? She was quiet for a moment, thinking. Because when people are mean, it's usually because they're hurting inside. And sometimes if you're nice to them, it helps them remember how to be nice too. The wisdom of children never ceased to amaze me. Here was my 7-year-old daughter, articulating something that most adults spend their whole lives trying to understand. That's very thoughtful of you, I said. But you know that they were mean to you, right? And that wasn't okay. I know. But Daddy always said that forgiveness doesn't mean letting people hurt you again. It means not carrying their meanness around in your heart. I pulled into our parking space and turned to look at my daughter, this incredible little person, who had somehow managed to learn the most important lesson of all without anyone teaching it to her. What do you think about maybe giving them another chance? I asked carefully. Not right away, and only if they promise to be kind to you, but maybe someday. Zoe considered this seriously. When do you think they've learned how to be nice? I don't know yet, but maybe we could find out, together. She nodded. Okay, but only if you're there with me, and only if they say sorry first. Deal, I said, kissing her forehead. 6 months later, we met the Harringtons at a neutral location, a family restaurant in a town halfway between Columbus and Cincinnati. Karen and Paul came alone. Marcus was still in Cleveland, working on his own problems. It was awkward at first. Karen cried when she saw Zoe, and Paul could barely speak. But Zoe, in her infinite grace, simply walked over to them and said, "Thank you for saying sorry. I forgive you." It wasn't a magical transformation. Rebuilding trust takes time, and there were difficult conversations and careful boundaries to navigate. But slowly, gradually, something that resembled a relationship began to form. Paul started sending Zoe cards on holidays, always including a picture of David from his childhood. Karen began calling once a week, asking about school and friends and whether Zoe needed anything. They were tentative steps, but they were steps in the right direction. Marcus eventually moved back to Ohio and joined a treatment program for his drinking. He wrote Zoe a letter, not asking for forgiveness, but acknowledging the harm he had caused and promising to do better. It was a start. Today, 2 years later, Zoe spends 1 weekend a month with her grandparents. They've converted their guest room into a proper bedroom for her, decorated with pictures of David and filled with books and toys chosen specifically for her. They're not perfect. They're still learning how to be the kind of grandparents she deserves, but they're trying, and sometimes that's enough. The story of our weekend at the Harringtons became something bigger than I ever expected. I've spoken at veterans conferences about the importance of supporting military families. I've testified before state legislators about children's rights. I've helped dozens of families navigate similar situations through my work at the law firm. But the most important outcome is sitting at my kitchen table right now, doing homework, and humming quietly to herself. Zoe is 9 years old now, confident and kind and absolutely secure in the knowledge that she is loved and worthy of love. She knows her father was a hero, and she knows that she carries his legacy forward every day. She also knows that sometimes people make mistakes, and that forgiveness is possible even after the worst kinds of hurt. She knows that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. And she knows that families come in all different shapes and sizes, but they're always built on love and respect and the commitment to protect each other. These are lessons I couldn't have taught her through words alone. She learned them by watching what happened when someone tried to tell her she didn't matter, and seeing how the world responded by proving them wrong. The Harringtons learned something too. They learned that actions have consequences, that children are not disposable, and that the love of a community can be more powerful than the cruelty of individuals. They learned that redemption is possible, but it requires genuine accountability and a willingness to change. Most importantly, they learned that Zoe Mitchell is exactly who she was always meant to be, a child worthy of love, respect, and every opportunity life has to offer. She is David's daughter, and David's legacy, and she will never again be made to feel otherwise. Sometimes justice looks like punishment. Sometimes it looks like public accountability. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, it looks like healing and growth, and the chance for everyone involved to become better than they were before. In our case, it looked like all of those things. And in the end, that's the story I'm proudest to tell. Not just the story of how we fought back against cruelty, but the story of how we all learned to do better. David would be proud of the woman his daughter is becoming. But more than that, I think he'd be proud of the family she's helped create. One that includes not just the people who love her unconditionally, but also the people who learn to love her by watching her love them in return. That's the real victory. That's the ending I never saw coming when I tucked my 7-year-old daughter into that sleeping bag on a cold concrete floor. Love won. In the end, love always wins.